Welcome to lesson number 9 in our series entitled Let's Take Another Look, Passages from the Old Testament. Today we'll be looking at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is found in Daniel 3. A little bit of a background before we get to that actual story. Nebuchadnezzar was a king of Babylon, of the Babylonian Empire, from 605 to 562 BC. He was the longest serving monarch of the Babylonian Empire and the most powerful one as well. Many people kind of know the name not just because it's an interesting name to say, but because he was in charge when the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were constructed, considered one of the great 7 ancient wonders of the world. The conquering and looting of the country of Judah had taken place in around 597 BC, but in 586 they kind of did a full, what came to be known as the Babylonian Exile, where they came in and deported people from Judah out into the different regions of the Babylonian Empire. They imported people into these now empty homes. They destroyed the temple and looted all of that, and most of that was lost to history. Most of those vessels, those sacred vessels that were there in the temple. 4 of those who were exiled were 4 young men named Daniel, Hananiah, Misheal, and Azariah. The book of Daniel, chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, describes these young men, as being of noble birth, and they were, quote, without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. And so the Babylonians saw promise in these 4 young men, and so they took them up to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar then gave them Babylonian names. Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Misheal became Meschach, and Azariah became Abednego. Now, there's no universal agreement on this name change, but many scholars have noted over the years that in Hebrew, the word Hananiah, the name Hananiah, means Jehovah is gracious. Misheal means he who belongs to God. And Azariah means Jehovah helps. And it's important to think about this because the name that somebody was given was meant to reflect their character and who they were. And that was all throughout, and says God tells Abraham and Sarah when they laugh because he tells them they're going to have a child in Sarah's old age. He says, you're going to name the child Isaac, therefore, because it means he who laughs. And those are many examples all throughout the Old Testament. I talk about this a bit with Jacob and Esau. And so he gives them then new Babylonian names. And if the name reflects the character, then the name change is also to reflect their new life in Babylon. At this time, there was no expectation that they would return home. It's certainly not by Nebuchadnezzar, who figured that the Babylonians would rule for a very, very long time. Some scholars believe that these new Babylonian names of Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego reflected Babylonian gods, and that the names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in particular reflected the names the Babylonian gods Marduk, Aku, and Nebo or Nebu. Others say that they might have referred to different and other Babylonian gods, but the intent regardless was the same. The change was not only of their name, but it was a reflection of their character or who they were going to become. Now, understanding these names is important because it sets up a contrast between who they were as servants of God. Jehovah is gracious. Jehovah helps, the one who belongs to God. They were setting those up as a contrast between these servants of God and who Nebuchadnezzar intended for them to be. Because of their background and because of their wisdom, then they were taught all matters Chaldean, and Chaldean is another name for Babylon. They were taught Chaldean literature. They were taught, of course, the Chaldean language, so that after a 3-year period of training, they would be prepared to serve in the king's court. They would be valuable because they would have knowledge of Hebrew, but then also, and whatever else they had learned, but then also knowledge of the Chaldean literature and language and kind of customs. Again, it's meant to go in conjunction with that name change. They have a new life now that is different from that in their worship of Yahweh. So Daniel, Hananiah, Misheal, and Azariah are given what are called royal rations because of their new status and working there in the king's palace. The royal rations meant that they had the highest amount and the highest quality of food. But the problem was that the food violated the law. So they went to the king's right-hand person and said, we cannot eat this according to the law. And this man says, well, we're afraid if you don't, then you will become weak because these are the best food. This is the best food that's out there. And they say, well, I tell you what, let us eat our own food according to the law. And then after a period of time, if we then show that we are worse off, we will then eat your food. And of course, God blesses them. They eat the food that is in accordance with the law, the Jewish law. And after that period of time, not only are they as healthy, they're actually healthier than those who had been consuming the, quote, royal rations. So, first battle goes to God. They were able to just keep eating the food that they were eating and thus also be able to keep their commitment to Yahweh, commitment to their God instead of serving the Babylonian gods. Next, what happens is that, this is in chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that disturbs him. So he summons his magicians and the interpreters of dreams and orders them to tell him what his dream was, as well as the interpretation. Well, they say, well, King, if you will tell us the dream, we can tell you the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar says, no, I want you to tell me what my dream was and the interpretation of the dream. And if you don't do it, I'm going to have you torn limb from limb, because you are not able to do what I command. If you are truly magicians and interpreters of dreams, you ought to know what the dream is before I tell it, and also be able to interpret it. And he is ordering Daniel and Hananiah and Misheal and Azariah, now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He orders them to be the ones who would execute these magicians and interpreters of dreams. But instead, Daniel tells these men to ask God to reveal to Daniel the dream and its meaning. And God does so, and he is able to save those, quote, wise men of Babylon. Daniel, through the help of God, is able to do what these magicians and interpreters. So round 2 goes to God, as God is able to do through Daniel what Nebuchadnezzar's or the Babylonian gods, magicians and interpreters of dreams, could not do. So twice now, God has proven his faithfulness, and God has rewarded and blessed Daniel. And through that also rewarded those magicians, because they were not killed. After this then, Daniel is placed in charge of the king's magicians and interpreter of dreams. So in other words, Daniel is placed over Babylonian people. They are now subject to Daniel because of Daniel's wisdom. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego then are appointed. They are elevated, not as high as Daniel, but they're appointed over the province of Babylon. And then this is where the third chapter begins. Before we do that, real quick, the dream, because it's going to come to play. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is of a huge statue of his. And I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but the dream is that, the statue crumbles, and Daniel interprets that dream. I'd really encourage you to go and read Daniel 1 and 2. If you need to pause before we go on to Daniel 3. But I gave you kind of a synopsis of Daniel 1 and Daniel 2 there. So we're going to move on to Daniel 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, and the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. While they were standing before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the harp, lyre, of the pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the province of Babylon and its affairs, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods. They do not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and that you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, you should fall down and worship the statue that I have made. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense before you in this matter. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments. And they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent, and because the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselor, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" They answered him, "True, O king." Nebuchadnezzar then said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the governors, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors all gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their head was not singed. Their tunics were not scorched, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's commands and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. What a story. And we'll look at that very closely now. Nebuchadnezzar builds a golden statue of himself. The golden statue is 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He orders all the officials of the court to come to the dedication of the statue. And at the sound of all the instruments, they are to bow down and worship the statue. And any who do not do that will be thrown, they say, immediately into the fiery furnace. Now, I mentioned, and part of the reason I'm mentioning in an introduction, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, was that the part of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had was that he had built a huge statue of himself and that the statue came crumbling down, and Daniel, in the midst of that, prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar himself would be torn down, that someone inferior to him would take his place, and that eventually his empire would be torn down as well. So the dream was of the crumbling of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. When Daniel tells the dream and interprets it, Nebuchadnezzar, far from being angry, promotes Daniel because of Daniel's wisdom, a wisdom which Daniel pointedly says comes from Yahweh, comes from God. But what's the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learns from this dream? I think a big statue would look great. So knowing the interpretation of the dream, Nebuchadnezzar still goes forward and builds a 90-foot statue, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, made of gold. And they gather everybody and say, "You will bow down and worship me." Everybody bows down except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, up until this point, Daniel is always mentioned with them. But notice he's not here. We'll look at the next lesson, is the story of Daniel and the lion's den. It's presumed that Daniel must have been away on some sort of business and mission, because he's not mentioned in this account. And they said we'll have our own story of Daniel's faithfulness in the next lesson. Of course, people notice and point out to Nebuchadnezzar that these three men, who are Jews from exiles from Babylon, from Judah, exiled to Babylon, that they refuse to bow down and worship. Nebuchadnezzar is furious, calls them to the court, reminds them of the consequences of their disobedience, and tells them what will happen if they, having now had a second opportunity, do not bow down at this point. And he says this interesting phrase, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? In other words, there is nobody more powerful than me. My gods are more powerful than your God is, because I, through my gods, have conquered you. So clearly, I'm more powerful. I'm as king. The Babylonian gods are more powerful than your God. He doesn't say that directly, but it's definitely implied. And so, if you don't, who's going to save you from me if you fail to bow down and worship? And I love the response. It's just a beautiful response. They say, we're not going to make a defense before you. We're not going to offer any excuse or blame. We worship only God, and that's as far as it goes. Nothing more needs to be said about it. We worship God, and God either will or will not deliver us. But regardless of what happens, we will continue to worship only God. We will not worship you. No matter what it is, God's saving of them, you notice, has no bearing on their understanding of God's power and love for them. It has no bearing on the strength of their faith. The strength of their faith is based on who God is, not what God might do for them in this particular circumstance. They make no conditions. They make no bargains. And before we get to Nebuchadnezzar's response, I want to kind of continue that theme just a little bit more. Their faith is based on trust in God. So often what we do is we try to get God to do what we want to do, to bless what we want to do, or we try to get God to do what we want God to do. We try to get God to respond like we want God to respond, or how we might respond, and we want God to honor and bless that. Instead of saying, Lord, I trust in you. I'm here. This is what is happening. No matter what happens, my hope and my trust is still in you. I trust in your divine love and power. They don't try to bargain. They don't try to strike a deal. They don't prevaricate on it. They don't try to rally other people to their cause. They simply let their faith stand on its own, and with that total trust and commitment to God. God has delivered them from other things, and they have that confidence, it seems, that God will deliver them. But they say, even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship anybody else other than God. We're not going to tarnish our witness. We're not going to recant our faith in order to try to convince God to do or not do something. We simply refuse to worship any God other than our God. And then whatever it is God will do, we submit ourselves to. In our day and time, Christ gives us the commandment to go and tell others, to be witnesses of what it is that God has done. And we are called to do that through our speech as well as through our actions. But it's the rare thing to argue someone into faith who's at least not ready to listen, to convince somebody who's not willing to at least engage in the conversation. But so many times what makes that biggest impact is not so much the words we say, though those are obviously of critical importance. It's the life we live. It's the integrity of our faith. It's that combination of the words and the deeds and the attitude that we demonstrate consistently across time. It's people observing us and seeing that no matter what happens, whether we're up in the great triumphs of life and things are going wonderfully, or whether we are down in the doldrums and we're going through great trial, that regardless of what it is, we remain consistent in what we say and what we do, and maintaining that faith towards God. It remains true no matter what internal or external threats there might be. Nebuchadnezzar, as powerful as he is on this earth at that time, on this earth at this time, no matter how powerful he thinks he is, no matter how powerful he believes his gods are, Nebuchadnezzar is not going to be able to shame or threaten, bully, or convince Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to turn away from God. That threat of death doesn't even do it. They know who Nebuchadnezzar is, and they know who God is, and they are going to stay faithful to God. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is not used to being contradicted, especially defied to his face in the presence of other people. And it says that he gets so mad that his face becomes distorted, and he orders the furnace to be heated to 7 times its normal temperature. Now, I've made this point with the number 40 in the past. When we look at numbers in the Bible, and there are certain numbers in the Bible, particularly like 3, 7, 12, 40, that have particular meaning and importance. Here, this number 7 means more than just 7 times hotter. It's not as if they got a temperature gauge, and put it in there and said, oh, it's now 7 times hotter than it was. No, 7 times hotter, 7 was a number of perfection. It was a number of completion. In other words, the 7 times hotter was he got that thing as hot as it could possibly be, as hot as it had ever been. And they tell us that and Daniel tells us that it is so hot that the men who are throwing them into the furnace are burned up, even though we will see that the same thing does not happen to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men are even killed just by getting anywhere near the furnace from how hot and overheated this furnace is. And as he's moving us towards, as the story is moving towards them being thrown in, the book of Daniel gives us little clues. they demonstrate a statement of faith that God can deliver them. But even if he doesn't, he says, we will not submit to the king. We will not disobey God. And so that's kind of one little clue that, well, maybe God is going to spare them in this instance. The temperature of the fire and the dying of the servants of the king who are going to throw them in is another thing to talk about how hot it is. And then it goes into great detail. Do you notice all the description of the clothing? Their trousers, their tunic, their hat, and all of their clothing. In other words, the writer of Daniel is making sure to say they had all of their clothes on too, being thrown into this furnace that is 7 times hotter than that is as hot as it could possibly get. It is so hot that it has even killed the people who are pushing them towards the furnace. But we see what happens. They're thrown down into that furnace of the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar, it says, is astonished. He's stunned. He stands up. And he looks over and he says, weren't there 3 men I had thrown into the fire? And they said, oh, yes, King, that's it. There were 3. And he says, well, why are there 4 people walking around? Weren't they bound when I threw them in? But now they're walking around unbound. And he says there is the appearance. The 4th person has the appearance of a God. Others may say the Son of God, and some have interpreted that to be the Christ. I think that might be a little bit of a backtracking into from our New Testament times into that. But clearly an angel or of some sort, some other divine being, whoever that is, and how we want to look at that. There's a 4th person, a representative of God, a divine being who is walking around in that furnace with them. Now we have to remember, of course, again, that Nebuchadnezzar does not think of the God of Israel, the God of Judah, in the same way that the Israelites think of God. The Babylonians had multitudes of gods that they worshiped, whereas the Israelites worshiped only one God. In fact, they were the only ones in that region that worshiped just one God. All the others had the multitude of gods that they worshiped. And they believed that these gods were greater than human beings, but they also believed that these gods oftentimes had human characteristics. And one of my other favorite stories in the Old Testament, which we're not going to look at this time, comes from 1 Kings 18, where Elijah goes up against the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, and the way that they look at those. And at some point, Elijah taunts them. And one of the taunts about when the gods are not following through for the high priest, he taunts them by saying, like, well, maybe they're asleep, or maybe they went off and had to go to the bathroom. He uses a euphemism there, but that's what he means. Maybe they had to wander away for a while. In other words, Elijah's saying to them, your gods are like maybe greater maybe than just regular human beings, but they're not as great as Yahweh, who is totally other, who is the creator, who is set apart, who is holy, who is set apart from his creation, who has created everything but is set apart from his creation, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who delivered them to freedom, and the God who they believe, even in the midst of this Babylonian exile, is going to be there for them. And so the way they viewed their gods was even different than the way that the people of Israel, here the people of Judah, viewed who God is, the very fundamental nature of God. Well, Nebuchadnezzar can't help but notice that God was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's no other explanation. They have been saved by their God, as Nebuchadnezzar sees it. So he orders them to come out of the furnace. And I want to reread the description from verse 27 about what they were like when they came out. The fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair on their heads was not singed. Their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. And I love that last line in particular. They didn't even smell like smoke. It's as if they had never been in that furnace, though everybody could see that they had been thrown in there. Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that the God of Israelites is who saved them, and he released them then from being required to worship the other gods. He freed them to be able to worship the God of Israel, their God and their God alone. And then he promoted them to even greater responsibility in the midst of this. So Nebuchadnezzar, in this short run, has kind of a total change in how he views this God. Now, I want to say just a quick word about that, because he says something about if you say a word against this God, you'll be convicted of blasphemy or things like that. There's no indication that Nebuchadnezzar ever had any actual faith in Yahweh, in God. He continued to worship the other Babylonian gods. There's nothing that ever indicates he showed anything else. I think rather the kind of the tagline or the end of this story is Daniel's way, the book of Daniel's way of saying that Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged the power of God in this instance. And he said, well, this God must be, recognizes that this God must be powerful. And so in that, he allows Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to continue in that worship of God. Of course, remember, they were going to do that anyway. But here Nebuchadnezzar gives us his consent and basically gives his protection. Basically what he's saying here is don't bother them about doing this anymore. Their God has proved himself worthy. There's a book that I've had for many, many years. It's probably close to 30 years, and by a man named Stephen Travis. I'm not even sure if it's still in print. If it is in print, it's worth going to get. It's called The Bible in Time. And he says this about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, for genuine disciples, the big question is, what does the Lord require of me? Instead of asking the question, what do I get out of it? And in the Wesley one-volume commentary, the author of this portion of Daniel, whose actually his name is Daniel J. Bunn, writes these words. Readers are invited to respond to threats and persecution in light of deep-seated conviction, not in light of whether they receive favor or disrespect. And the reason I wanted to highlight those particular quotes is that they get to that question of, why are we faithful? It's a question, by the way, that the people of Judah had to ask themselves. After all, for about 150 years before, 140 years before, they had seen the nation of Israel, the actual 10 tribes that formed the nation of Israel. They had been wiped out by the Assyrians. Now the Babylonians had deported the nation of Judah. They were on the verge of being wiped out. And they faced an existential question during this Babylonian exile. That's why a lot of the Psalms deal with them. A lot of the prophets deal with them. This question of, if these gods, these Babylonian gods are so powerful, why not worship them? Why continue to worship our God if those other gods are more powerful? And this is just one story, one example of where we see God's protection and guidance of them. And then as we go and read throughout the prophets, where God says, I haven't forgotten you. And he gives a meaning to and purpose behind their suffering. When we look at our trials today, we have to ask that question, why are we faithful? Is it because of what we expect from God? Is it because we hope that God will do what we want God to do, or we hope God will bless what we want? Or is it because we have seen the goodness and the providence of God? We know who God is because of who God is, as our Creator, our Redeemer, the one who has given us all, the one who has given us our very lives. And then do we respond in that trust, not out of what we hope God will do for us, but out of thanksgiving for what God already has done? Do we trust that God is with us today? Do we trust that God will see us through those times of trial? Do we trust that God can do what God decides to do, and that whatever God decides to do is in accordance with his perfect will and his perfect knowledge and indeed his perfect love, even if we don't fully understand it this day? Do we trust that even when it appears that the forces of the world, that the forces of evil are prevailing, that God is still in charge, that God is still in control, that God will ultimately prevail? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted in God no matter what. And they said, we will not bow down. We will continue to worship him even if God does not spare our lives. Of course, God did spare their lives. And what happened was that God continued to use them then as a witness beyond this time. as they gained even greater responsibility and as they continued to be those faithful witnesses. When we are faced with decisions about who we're going to give our allegiance to, who we're going to offer our trust to, we face those same types of questions that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced. Maybe not being thrown into a fiery furnace or faced with possible actual execution or death. But we face consequences. We have those decisions as to who we're going to trust in. Are we going to trust in God even when it appears that other forces are winning? Or are we going to trust that God ultimately is victorious, that God is the one in control, and that God's love is ever present, that God's power is ever present, that God's compassion and mercy, that God's grace are ever present? We see how God continued to use Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. How will God continue to use you in these days and weeks and months and years ahead? Thank you for taking time to spend as we looked again at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their time in the fiery furnace. The next lesson is Daniel in the lion's den. The lesson after that is the valley of the dry bones. And that will conclude our series for this time. Just a reminder, you're invited to tune back in here. I usually try to record these on the morning after I do a Bible study, and which is usually on Wednesday nights. And so I will continue to record those. And if you're watching this in real time, our last study will be on Wednesday night, November the 15th. And so the last video will be on the 16th. And then we will conclude the passages for this particular series. Thank you for taking the time today to join me. I look forward to being with you next time. God bless you and have a great day.